Hello.
How's it going?
Going good. The recording automatically started, so we are set with that. It is good to go there.
Awesome.
I can pause it if you want to talk through some stuff so it doesn't like
Yeah,
speak
good
and
idea.
like run
Maybe
through. Okay.
we will post this after the fact, but heads up, you are being recorded. We would love for this to be more of a discussion at times, and so don't be afraid to stop me. I'm going to talk a lot today because I did not do what I'm going to recommend later in the presentation and delegate for this one. But we are planning to run this on an annual basis, and I'll be delegating in the future. And so you're going to hear a lot from me today, but please jump in, ask questions. If you are involved already and know kind of certain things and want to add something, that would be very welcome as well. So it looks like you don't have to use only one word, but Emily, but I obviously didn't follow my own directions and put busy but fun. But for those folks that are just joining, we've got, if you could rename yourself in the chat if you're able, name, chapter, and role. So you can see mine as Julia, Arizona, and WIM USA president. And then we've got an icebreaker going if you want to speak up and say how your week is going in one word or a few, or put it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. I see thunderstormy, which makes me really jealous. I love thunderstorms. Eventful, have momentum, love to see it, productive. Mine's been very busy, but also great. Had a good week. I had an all-day leadership training yesterday. I love that kind of stuff. I got to do like a new personality test. Also love that stuff. So, all right, I think we've got a pretty good contingent here. We'll maybe give it one more minute till 9:35 to let folks join before we dive in. Rewarding. Love that one. Busy, busy, busy. I hear that. Okay, let me see if I can actually control this. There we go. Oh, it's working, Emily. Good. All right, so welcome everyone. This is the first of what will likely become an annual WIM governance session. This was kind of born out of our presidential chapter president listening tour that we undertook last year, where most of the feedback we got was we need more guidance, we need more resources, lots of questions about how should I do this, what's this role versus that role. And so this is intended to kind of fill that gap. The meeting is recorded, as I mentioned, and we will upload the recording as well as the slides to the collaboration space. Some of this content will go directly into the collaboration space as well. And so we're filling some gaps in there through creating this content. And so if you aren't able to stay for the whole thing, or nobody in your chapter was able to make it, or somebody in your chapter that you wanted to be here, they'll have access to the recording. The overall goal is to share practical governance guidance and lessons learned, clarify roles and responsibility, discuss sustainable chapter leadership practices, provide resources, support tools, and then encourage collaboration between chapters. Crazy like me, says Dee Dee about her week. I agree, but only in the most flattering way. Um, so we decided to break this into two sessions because we had a lot of requests for what to cover. And we just didn't want to make you all sit here for 3 hours straight. Today, we're going to focus more on kind of leadership and governance. We're going to talk a little bit about WIM overall structure. We've made some changes there recently, so to clarify that, officer and committee roles and responsibilities, bylaws and governance documents, leadership culture and volunteer management, and building continuity and sustainability. On June 12th will be the second session, also recorded and posted. And we'll spend some time on elections and succession planning. Elections, there's a bit of succession planning stuff today. Elections, we went over in detail in a recent chapter leadership meeting, and so we might not spend as much time on that because we have that really well documented already in the collaboration space, and we'll probably do another chapter leadership meeting ahead of next year's elections as a refresher as well. Meetings and chapter operations, volunteer and committee engagement, financial and legal considerations, fundraising and sponsorship, and then also go over some of the templates, tools, and resources that we already have and that we're in the process of building. Again, we're planning to update this regularly annually. And I mentioned at the beginning, for those of you that weren't here yet, you're going to hear a lot from me today. I already spoke with some of the other WIM USA leadership that I will delegate the next time around, now that we have a lot of this built, but I'll be bringing in others to help run this in the future. You might get sick of my voice because you're going to hear only from me today. But again, I'd love for this to be a conversation. Don't be afraid to interrupt me. I talk really fast. I always try to control it. But if unmute, throw something in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. If you have a question or a comment, I'd I'd welcome the break from talking so much. So, all right. Any questions before we get started? Okay. So we made a new WIM USA structure map because we made some changes recently. For some context, for those of you that maybe weren't already on the board, at that point, we had a board of like, depending on how you counted it, at any given meeting, it could be upwards of like 60 voting people. And so generally, it's recommended that you don't go over 12. So we were quite a bit over that by about 5 times. And so we're trying to make sure that chapters and other stakeholders have a voice and are still represented, but that it's easier for us to get to a quorum, for example. That was one of the issues that we'd have. Student chapters, we're so grateful to have them involved, but at the same time, those leadership transitions happen pretty often, and it was hard a lot of times for those folks to attend. And so we did a bit of reorganizing and have gotten our board down a bit, by about half. So I think we're sitting at, actually, with the addition of the 2 new chapters, it's somewhere between 25 and 30, I think. So still a bit bigger than what would typically be recommended, but a lot more manageable than it was while still maintaining representation. And so basically, what you see down here are all the different state chapters. We have national representatives from each of those chapters that serve on our board. And then also, those folks can fill committee chair positions. And then we also have our at-large chapter, which typically consists of members that are from states or regions that do not have a state chapter. And so they get elected to our board in a very similar process that our officers do. And so we also included something in our bylaws this time around that we really want those folks to represent the regions from the folks that they actually represent. So ideally, our at-large representatives don't live in areas that already have chapters because they have access to events and support and community chapter engagement that the rest of the at-large chapter doesn't. And so that was a bit of a change this year. Committee chairs can be any volunteer. They are appointed based on interest by the executive committee, which is the officers. National reps in the past chapters had 2 voting positions. We reduced that to 1, again, just to have a easier to manage board. But chapters can have as many representatives as they want. If you have 2 regular reps that you voted in and a couple alternates, that's okay. The way we're going to move forward with this is basically what we ask that ahead of board meetings, which we'll talk about a bit. Those reps come together and basically ensure that they have representation and determine who's voting that day on issues. And so at our first board meeting under this structure, and typically it'd be a July board meeting, but I think we're having to schedule it in August. We'll likely start out by the recording secretary, Debbie, asking who's voting for your chapter today. So there's 1 vote per chapter, 1 vote per committee, and then 1 vote for the at-large chapter as well. And then also the Education Foundation has a voting spot on our board. And so they elect a representative to or they appoint a representative to vote for them at the board meetings as well. Out of this pool, the officers are elected. We do that through a nominating committee that is chaired by the vice president. And so that comes from national representatives, committee chairs, and at large reps. And then we vote on it at the annual meeting in April. So we just did that. These officers serve 1-year terms, and it's recommended that they serve a maximum of 3 consecutive years in the same role. I had jotted down that I was going to look in the bylaws and make sure I quoting that correctly, and did not have time to do that, but I will before we upload this document, that if it's a maximum, I think it's recommended that you stay in for 3 years because it's hard to get a lot done in a single year. And I think there is a maximum there at 3 years. So we want to make sure we're making space for new folks to come in. And then the larger leadership body now includes the student chapter representatives. And so they no longer, thank you, Judy, max 3 years is correct. They no longer have a vote, but they still have a voice. We really encourage them to come to all of the board meetings so that they are able to exercise that voice. Also, we have a student liaison committee that's currently chaired by Christy Miller and Madison Sandoval. And so we are making some changes to that includes a requirement that students are involved in that, or not a requirement that all students are involved in that, but we want to make sure the committee always has students on it. And then also we're going to start asking for at least 1 or 2 faculty advisors to get involved as well, so that we have a bit of a better connection there. So we really want our students to have a voice, but they do no longer have a vote on the board. And then the alternate national and at-large reps are also part of the leadership body. We strongly recommend that you also attend every board meeting, even if you're not the voting representative that particular day. If you are in the future, it allows you to stay up to date on current discussion points and potential voting topics. And then there's also a role for the past president. And so that's to help with leadership transition. They don't have a vote, but they're part of the leadership body. Any questions about this structure before we move on? All right. In my leadership training that I took yesterday, I committed to practicing being less awkward in silence. So I'm trying to take longer pauses to allow people time to speak. So if I do move on before you had a chance to ask your question, please don't hesitate to speak up, and I can always go back. All right, just a quick summary of the relationship between chapters and WIM USA. WIM USA really exists to support, connect, and strengthen chapters. We are all separate entities. For the most part, the state chapters all have their own 501c status. And so you have a lot of autonomy. And so it's completely up to the chapters to determine what local programming and events you'll put on, your budget priorities, and how you're using your funds. For the most part, you can make up your own board and committee structure. And so there's a few roles and recommendations that we have later in this presentation. But if you have a specific committee that would meet the needs of your community and your members, you're welcome to create a committee that isn't necessarily another at the USA level or typical of other chapters. You can focus.
You're
You
on
went
mute.
on mute, Julia.
I apologize. There was a waiting room discrepancy, and when they hit admit, it hit mute. We're
No
good now.
worries. Awesome. Cool. Thanks. You have a lot of autonomy when it comes to areas of focus and your strategic priorities. There's a little bit of limitation on that I'll talk about on the next slide. Local partnerships and initiatives. Some chapters are really well connected to their local SME, or maybe an AIPG section, or a mining association. That's all great and very welcome. And then we do ask you to commit when a new chapter forms to at least 2 of the 4 WIM USA priorities, but how you meet the commitments that you make to your members is up to you. Where it's useful for us to coordinate is on branding and shared messaging. Our PR and communications team, Jessica and Glenda, are actively working on that, on providing more templates to help you with that kind of stuff. Although you're also welcome to create your own. National initiatives like the conference and the mentor network. We'd love to collaborate on those things. WIM USA maintains overall control over that, but we want your involvement wherever possible. Sponsorship and fundraising support. We've made a lot of changes over the last year to try to better serve you and WIM overall. Emily Hagena and now Lacey are working on that and ensuring that chapters are involved in that process, but also trying to take some of the weight off of the chapters when it comes to making sure we're meeting the needs of our sponsors, because that can get difficult through leadership transitions. New chapter development and support. Our membership committee and our bylaws and governance committee help with that. And then, of course, USA hosts the website, the membership platforms, and provides other administrative support and guidance. I think the overall point, though, is that if you need help, please don't be afraid to ask. If you have an idea or your chapter's facing some sort of issue or anything at all comes up, we're here to help you. WIM USA is really here to serve the chapters. So please reach out to us. Don't hesitate. You can get to me. Everybody should have my email. If you don't, I'll make sure that you do. Or you can reach out to Stuart and he'll make sure you get connected to who you need to get connected to if you're unsure. We'll also be adding, there is a chapter leadership contact list on the collaboration space, which we're going to talk more about in the next session. If you haven't seen the collaboration space yet, perhaps perhaps Debbie or Emily would be willing to post a link to the collaboration space in the chat. But we'll be adding some contact information for the different WIM USA chapters there as well. So that's easy to find. But point is, please don't hesitate to reach out to us for help. No matter what it is, we might not be able to have an immediate answer, but we want to know and we'll do our best. Any questions on this or comments? All right, I will move on. Oh, I didn't know where those bubbles came from, but I'm not mad about them.
Love the
So
bubbles.
yeah, I
Great
steal
catch.
slides from other presentations, so I would have probably put them in at one point. These are the four WIM USA commitments. And again, just restating, our primary objective is to support you all, our chapters, and your objectives. And then the ask is when a new chapter forms that in your bylaws, as part of your mission or objective, you pick at least two of these commitments that you also want to support through your chapter. And so education. So the goal of that, of course, is to change misconceptions of the extractive industries, really to educate whether it's K through 12 students, college students, the general public about the important role of mining in society and in their lives overall. And then advocacy. Um, so that's basically our efforts to foster a more inclusive mining industry that allows space for everybody, regardless of gender or other background. Empowerment. So what falls under that is our conference and other professional development and networking opportunities. We really feel strongly that bringing folks together is the best way to ensure that they feel supported working in the mining industry and to help with recruiting and retention. And then finally, inspiration. And so what would fall under this is like a scholarship program or partnering with student chapters and getting involved in the mentor network, et cetera. So really that's a focus on future generations, whether it's students, younger professionals, et cetera. All right. So the next few slides, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. So we scheduled this meeting for 2 hours. I don't think we're going to need all of that time unless we get into conversation, which would be very welcome. But if it seems like we're going to end sooner than an hour and a half or so, we may not take a break. But we may take a bio break after 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how quickly we get through things. So we're actually going at quite a clip. So if folks think it's time to take a break, mention it in the chat or unmute and let me know. But I'll plan on one around 10:30, 5 minutes or so bio break. Otherwise, we'll just keep going and kind of see how quickly we get through things. Officers and committee roles. So, I have some content that's a little bit more detailed on this planned to put in the governance documentation on the WIM collaboration space after this. But I've just kept it pretty short here because I didn't want to overwhelm you with too many words. And I'm putting up the typical officer roles. And by officer, I mean just basically anybody that's typically elected by your membership. Most chapters have a nominating committee process that where a nominating committee, often chaired by the vice president and made up of the overall board. It might just be the committee chairs and the vice president. Sometimes it's the vice president and the officers. Sometimes it's that whole group that seeks out a list of names to fill these roles. A lot of times it's only one person. In some cases, it makes sense for it to be two. I think more often than not, it's one person. We expect the nominating committee I think members expect the nominating committee to know kind of who's best to fill each role. And so they might not necessarily know that, but if they're getting put forward for a vote, the assumption is that the nominating committee is making that decision based on previous engagement. Although I know in some cases it makes sense to have two folks there. So, and then the members will typically vote on this. Your bylaws will state whether or not you have a quorum that needs to be met in terms of the number of members that vote on it. Again, that will be added. These kinds of details will be added to the governance page on the WIM collaboration space. It doesn't look like it's been shared yet, but let's see if I can grab it really quick to the collaboration space. For those that haven't seen it, I think it'd be helpful for you to be able to have that link. So let me grab it. I'd recommend you bookmark that. It is not fully built out yet, but our goal is for that to kind of be the hub for information and information sharing, etc. Another thing to note, it can be really difficult, especially in some states, to kind of diversify this group is also really early on in a chapter formation. Ideally, not all of these roles are filled by people from any one company. We've had issues in the past where that's led to, if there's one or two that aren't from that company feeling kind of left out or not well represented, because when you all work for the same company, it can just be really easy to have an ad hoc meeting and schedule times, etc. But again, we are a volunteer organization. It can be really difficult to recruit folks. And so if there is a year or two where you struggle to do that, it's not the end of the world. But overall, the goal is typically to have good representation from across your state as well as different companies, etc. Again, I know that can be difficult. So this is suggestion, not necessarily direction, but if you can diversify that, that's definitely a goal that we recommend you have. So the president, of course, is the kind of the person that sets the tone and direction for the chapter. The president does not do everything, of course. I would say that the best president, especially of a volunteer organization, creates structure and provides support and really just overall develops an environment that allows other volunteers to succeed. They're not necessarily doing a lot of the work, but they are more there to help the other volunteers get the actual work done. Of course, they do a lot of work themselves, but at the same time, ideally, they have a really good team around them. The vice president, I think of as like just kind of the president's primary backup and leadership partner. Ideally, they're involved enough in chapter operations that if the president goes on a couple-week vacation and there's some meetings in that time, they're able to step right in and lead meetings, etc. The way that when I was a chapter president in Arizona, my vice president and I, Maria Bertram, split some responsibilities up as I took on about 50 to 60% of the committees and was like an ad hoc member of all of those committees. And she took on the other component of them. I think I took five and she took three or something like that. And then we'd communicate with each other. Oh, this committee needs this support, and can you step in during this meeting, et cetera. And so one of us was involved in everything, and we were just in regular communication about how we can support each other and support the committees that each other was kind of assigned to be more involved in. The treasurer, I always say this is kind of the most important and most difficult and often most thankless role. I shouldn't say that out loud because I know we're actively trying to recruit treasurers into some chapters, and it's always one that we need to be succession planning for. But the treasurer is the chapter's fiscal officer. They're responsible for maintaining financial records, tracking income and expenses, helping to develop the budget, working with the committees to make sure that their budget needs are met, and then ensuring any required taxes, et cetera, are completed. And so it's a really important role because financial management, of course, is really important. And also, effective financial management really just helps build trust with our members and our sponsors and future leaders. And so this role can be a lot of work in the sense that if there is a lot of chapter activity, you might be working with, I know Arizona uses QuickBooks, and there's a lot of back and forth between the USA treasurer and finance chair. And I know that we have plans in the near future to start setting up maybe semi-annual, twice-a-year meetings with treasurers and or secretaries to just kind of make sure that because that role can be kind of difficult, you have and stressful because you're the one that's in charge of the money, you have the support that you need. And so we're not exactly sure what that's going to look at like yet, but that's the plan, is to start establishing a check-in a couple times a year with all the treasurers, make sure that they feel supported, as well as we've been doing that with the presidents. And then the secretary role is really, the secretaries are kind of they can either be in two roles or one. If you've got the capacity, volunteer capacity to split it into two, that can be really helpful. If you don't, having just a single secretary is totally acceptable. I'll start with the recording secretary. They are really the keeper of the organization's institutional knowledge. And so they maintain meeting minutes. Often they're the person that's taking the minutes. Sometimes if they can't make the meeting, they might just be the one that ensures that information is stored. They organize the records, document major decisions, and then one thing that's really important that we've learned with a couple chapters is that can be lost in leadership transitions. That's typically a secretary role, sometimes the treasurer, is state filing. So in most states, I think all probably, you have to submit either annual or I think in Texas we learned it was every 4 years. You have to file with an annual corporation with the corporation commission. So some sort of report just kind of documenting your leadership, et cetera. It's usually pretty straightforward. I think in Texas it costs $5. In Arizona it costs maybe 25. In Colorado it costs 25. And so that's a really important rule that if you don't do that, those things can fall through the cracks. And so that's again another reason why we want to start having a specific treasurer and secretary check-in, because those a couple things, taxes and that filing that are often quite small, but they're a big deal. And so ensuring that secretaries and treasurers understand their responsibilities around that. The corresponding secretary typically serves in more of a communication role, as you might imagine. We added this role at the USA level last year, and we weren't totally sure what it was going to look like, but we've found it to be incredibly helpful, especially because there's been a lot of action at the USA level this year, a lot of change, which has all been good. But what the corresponding secretary, Emily, has helped with is internal and external communications. And so she's scheduling all of the larger committee meetings and the smaller committee meetings as well, because she's using the WIM USA Zoom, which allows for, if the person that scheduled the meeting did it with their work account, a lot of times others can't start it. So we're encouraging our committees to use the WIM USA Zoom so that others can start it if they have the username and password. She'll help me with sending out notices and invitations ahead of the meeting. So just been taking a lot off of my plate as a president. And so ahead of our board meetings, she helps make sure that I'm on top of getting information out to you all ahead of time so that you can review it before you might have to vote on it. Same with our committee leadership meetings, et cetera. And then, they can also fill a role that, depending on the size of the chapter, if the chapter doesn't have a communications, PR, marketing sort of committee, they can help with that role. It just kind of depends on what the needs of the chapter are. So that role can be kind of flexible. We weren't totally sure exactly what it would look like when we created it. We just knew we needed a bit more support, and it's turned out to be really helpful. So those details again we'll document in on the collaboration space to make sure that you have information you need to know to determine whether or not you want to add that role if you don't already have it. And then finally, national representatives are the chapter's voice within WIM USA. Really, the most important responsibility for that person is to show up at WIM USA executive board meetings. It's really important when Stuart reached out to the chapter during transitions to get that contact information in so we can make sure the right folks have invitations to those. Again, as mentioned when we talked about the structure, if you can't make a meeting, ideally you touch base with your other national representatives ahead of time to ensure that somebody else can. And so ideally you come to as many meetings as you can so that if you are voting, you are still informed and can bring information back to the chapter as well as bring information from the chapter to the board and WIM USA leadership overall. National representatives and really any member can get involved in national committees and initiatives, but you don't have to. It's not a requirement of the role. We'd love for you to, but really your main responsibility is maintaining that two-way communication between the chapter and WIM USA. And the best way to do that is to come to board meetings for sure, but if you can make the chapter leadership meetings, that's great too. Um, any questions about these roles and responsibilities? Or anything that doesn't look right to you all or different from what you might be doing. Practicing my silence comfort.
I think I do. I
Oh,
think
go
I do
ahead.
have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Um, I think we've struggled with particularly the management of the chapter email,
Mm,
and I was wondering, so it sounds like the corresponding secretary has really addressed that issue for you guys,
yes,
because we've really struggled with like who has access to it, because multiple people kind of want access,
totally.
but then things fall through the cracks. Um,
I'm really glad you asked that question because honestly, making the slide, it kind of I didn't remember the fact you guys don't have a Stuart. And so Stuart really helps us with that. And so I didn't mention email, but for a chapter and at Arizona, the way that it was run, at least in the past, was yes, the corresponding secretary was kind of the first, was responsible for the email in the sense that we ended up taking off everyone but officers, I think, in the PR communications committee because it was just confusing. There were too many people and nobody knew who was responding. And then when we added the corresponding secretary, the idea was they were the person that was responsible for responding or forwarding it on to the person that they thought should respond. So if it was a question about the membership committee, they'd forward it on to that chair. If it was, and even like, I think it was kind of the president and the corresponding secretary. And so if I saw that that person responded, I would, stay out of it. And if I knew that the corresponding secretary wasn't around or, wasn't able to get to it, I would jump in and respond. And beyond that, nobody else was supposed to respond unless they were asked to avoid confusion because we had a lot of that in the beginning as well. And so I think that's probably when it comes to a chapter, the most important role for that position is to manage the email. So I'm really glad you asked that question. Does that answer it?
yes, thank you.
Yeah.
There's
Amanda?
another question in the chat. How do you get people excited in joining?
I saw that, yeah. So that can be incredibly difficult. I think also what will happen too is there'll sometimes be like a groundswell of interest and then people will kind of fall off. And so even a chapter that's been super active in the past can go through periods of people get burnt out after a while managing a volunteer role with their day-to-day job and their families, etc. And so different chapters face this on different levels. And my advice is always to cast the net as wide as you possibly can And I think there's a bit of this later on in the presentation, but it can be hard, I think, to trust new people coming in with responsibilities because they haven't been involved in the past. But at the same time, I think in order to get people truly invested, they have to have some level of ownership. And so I've seen, and I've done this myself, encouraging people to get involved and then not giving them anything to do because I'm afraid to give them too much responsibility and have them drop the ball. But what I've kind of learned is like if you don't give them a task or you don't give them something to have ownership over, then they don't feel like they're doing much and they stop showing up. And so we are a volunteer organization. We're not doing brain surgery. If balls get dropped from time to time, it's okay, right? It's not the end of the world. I would say it's more important to cast your net wide, get as many people as possible involved. You can do kind of a volunteer campaign. We can help you set up emails to go out to your members, LinkedIn posts, etc. And then anybody that shows up, start asking like what they're interested in and find something for them to do from the get-go. Give them a task, and it doesn't have to be super important, but if it's something that'll move your chapter forward a bit, that ownership I found just really actually keeps them involved because in my experience, it's not as hard to get people to show up in the first place. It's hard to keep them coming back. Yeah, so at the collaboration space, there is actually, I'm not sure if we have the at-large member, a link to that. If we don't, we can make one. But what I would do, Terrence, is reach out to there is what, oh, sorry, that's for Terrence, you're from Texas. Apologies. There is definitely the membership list from Texas, but then also we can give you access or help you send out campaigns to all the members. And if you reach out to Stuart, he can point you towards where that list is if it's hard for you to find it in the collaboration space. Also, I believe we have some templates coming. I believe the PR and Communications Committee just sent out a survey to the different chapter leadership to hear about what templates they'd like to see. And if that would be a good thing to suggest. If you don't have that survey, I can forward it on and maybe paste it in the chat here that a membership campaign or a volunteer campaign template. I think that would be a good thing for USA to be able to provide. And then we can also help you get that sent out. We have a MailChimp account. We can segment it by Texas members, etc. And Debbie put Stuart's email in the chat. If whatever goes to Stuart, he kind of acts in the role that I described as a chapter corresponding secretary, forwards things on as needed, answers what he can. So it'll get to me or the appropriate committee when you reach out to that email. Any other questions on this? And again, like the exact roles and titles, most of these will stay the same except for maybe the secretary or the two secretary roles, but who does what might change a bit from chapter to chapter. But really, the most important thing is to create a structure that distributes work because volunteer work burnout is a very real thing and easy to have happen. And you really just want to make sure that you're supporting long-term chapter stability, sustainability. And I know it can be really hard to get people excited about getting involved, and sometimes it can feel like you're not making any progress. But if you can start getting folks to show up, start giving them some tasks to give them some ownership, I think that can make a big difference. And if that doesn't help, reach out to us and we can maybe hop on a call and brainstorm some ideas with you one-on-one. The next slide is kind of summarizing some recommended chapter committees. We've broken it out here into kind of core and nice to have committees. I think, especially if you're struggling to get people involved at the officer level, you might not be able to have 8 different committee chairs. And so what we kind of consider core committees, your members are, your most important constituents, right? Or your most important stakeholders to a certain extent. And so the membership committee is key. They can also take on communications if you don't have a communications and social media committee. And because truly the communication with the members is kind of the most important thing. And so if you don't have a super active LinkedIn, that's okay. But ideally, you've got some sort of regular comms with members, and membership committee can take that on if you don't have a committee specific to that. But then the membership committee also supports member engagement, recruitment, retention, and communication, like I mentioned. The way that the membership lists are reported out now, you'll see kind of a summary page that shows you new members since the last month and expired members since the last month. I get the Arizona emails because I'm part of the Arizona chapter, and they've been doing a really great job of every few months going in and reaching out to new members. I don't know if it's every month or every few months, but new members and welcoming them, letting them know how they can get involved, upcoming events, and expired members. And the subject is always WIM Arizona misses you and just encourages them, letting them know their membership has expired because sometimes they don't know they've gotten a new credit card or something. And so it expired for that reason and encouraging them to get more involved. And that I think has helped a lot with volunteer engagement as well. Um, because if you're hearing from the chapter, as soon as if you're signing up for a membership, it usually means that you're either wanting to get involved or you want to support in some way. And so if you're getting a welcome within a couple months of signing up, encouraging you to get more involved, I think you're a lot more likely to. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention on how you get people excited and joining that I won't spend too much time on today. But quick segue. The Arizona Ambassador Program has helped a lot with that, and we've already got documentation on that up on the collaboration space that I can link in the chat before the end of the meeting today. And so that's another way that Arizona has been really successful getting more folks involved, not just from kind of the bigger city hubs, but also from the mine sites across the state. So membership and communications is really there to support the members, ensure they feel engaged, make sure that we're serving their needs. Partnership and fundraising. Again, WIM USA has really tried to do a better job supporting the chapters and ensuring that their partnerships and their sponsors are better connected to WIM overall. And they're here to help you. And I know Emily and Lacey are reaching out to chapter leadership before they start targeting any kind of Utah, for example, or Arizona companies. Um, and so they'll reach out. I'm using Utah as an example because I think they just they were just reaching out to those folks recently. They reach out to the chapter leadership and say, hey, we want to help you stay connected to these folks. Do you want to, we don't want to do any kind of duplicate reach outs. If you've recently been talking to companies, let's work together on this. If you don't have plans to reach out soon, we can do that and we'll invite you. And just to ensure that we're not overloading our sponsors, but they feel connected and they've got at least an annual touch point. And then they use those meetings to get feedback from the sponsors, make sure that we're meeting their needs. And if we're not, what suggestions they have. You're welcome to do that yourself, but we're there to do it if your chapter doesn't have capacity to. And we're also going to do it on behalf of WIM USA regardless. But we'll make sure not to do it too often so that if you're doing reach outs, that's why they're including you to make sure that we're not stepping on your toes. We want you to make sure that you're maintaining those relationships as well as possible. And we're there just supporting and ensuring from the WIM USA perspective, they feel seen and heard and valued. So that's a pretty important one because the money is what helps the chapter do stuff. So having somebody in that role is pretty helpful to the officers so that you've got someone focused on that. President is often pretty involved in this kind of stuff too, but having a committee that helps is really useful. Programming and events. I think in the next session are going to talk more about, suggested event type, how to host events and suggested frequency. I really like a quarterly model. Once a quarter, you have some sort of event. Again, I will use Arizona as an example. I live in Arizona, so I know what they do. Usually in kind of Q1, they have some sort of golf tournament. That raises money for their scholarship committee. And then Q2, it's very hot in Arizona. I'm going by calendar year, not fiscal year. So Q1, January, sometime early in the year, March, April, usually is a golf tournament. Over the summer, it's quite hot. So calendar year Q2-ish. Sometimes it'll be a virtual event. They're planning something next weekend. That's a virtual event. In the past, we've also done in-person ones, but indoors. Q3 in September, because we have a really large Hispanic community here, we usually have a Spanish Heritage celebration. I think they're making some changes to that this year, but still some sort of celebration. They usually get upwards of 100 people. We've had mariachis in the past. There's a really cool high school mariachi band that's been like award winning and played at the White House and stuff. And so they've been invited. We had dancers last year not flamenco, but uh, I can't remember the name, but really cool dancers, piñata. We had a raffle. Always a really fun event. And then in December, aligned with the SME Arizona conference, they usually host a workshop that's kind of about some sort of professional development, a mentorship, and how to be a good mentor, how to find a mentor, all kinds of topics related to that. They've been doing it since 2017, I think. So coming on 10 years. And so that's kind of the cadence that WIM Arizona does. But we have a pretty centralized group that between Tucson and Phoenix, a lot of the folks that work at the mine sites are willing to travel to those things. And so different chapters like Idaho, Emily Hagenaw came and presented at the chapter leadership meeting recently and talked about their kind of hybrid structure. I know she'd be happy to talk to any other chapters that are interested in that, where they meet and virtually and then break out into in-person gatherings in kind of a few different spots across the state. So that committee, though, overall, again, we'll have some more details about those things and suggestions in the next meeting. Mine tours are another great event type, but that's what that committee's in charge of kind of organizing. And so to me, I think back in the day, we kind of considered everybody on the programming and events committee, but then there was always a chair and a co-chair that really led things because it's a lot of work to put those events together. And so we had a committee, but then everybody was invited to those meetings to help with the planning. Advertising early and often is always really important. And then finally, education and outreach. This one I debated whether or not to put in the core. If your chapter is not as focused on education and outreach, that's okay. You know, it's one of the 4 commitments, but most chapters are. Most chapters have some sort of education and outreach efforts. And so this group might table at certain events. They might organize. I get a lot of. There's a really good outreach program at U of A, and so I have those folks reach out to me a lot, like, "Hey, we're looking for a speaker at this school on this date," and I always go straight to WIM Arizona and say, "Hey, can somebody go and talk to the Morenci Elementary School students about rocks or whatever?" And so WIM, that committee can be really helpful in that way, as well as tabling, etc. And partnering also with other organizations is really common with the Education Outreach Committee as well. So those are kind of the core committees, the ones that most chapters have. And then the nice to have committees are committees that if you've got capacity, if you've got a lot of volunteers and you're able to fill chair roles, it's really nice to have a bylaws and governance committee. If there isn't one, the officers would handle this, the recording secretary, president, vice president, etc. But somebody that's keeping an eye on governance documents, which is, I think, the next topic that we'll touch on, bylaws, policies, and procedures, the difference between the two. And also just organizational structure, as well as sometimes strategic direction as well can be handled by this group. I think in Arizona, it might be called actually bylaws and strategy. And again, this can be handled by the chapter officers if you don't have a committee specific to this, and WIM USA can help you a bit as needed. Communications and social media, this can be really helpful. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but Alaska has been super active on LinkedIn lately, and I love all their posts, and they clearly have a very active, I don't know if it's committee or who, maybe corresponding secretary. And so if you've got capacity to do that, I love to see it, to just see, all those posts and show how active the chapter is and how active WIM USA is overall. Lots of chapters are posting all the time. I've just noticed Alaska's been doing it a lot lately and posting about USA initiatives, which I'm incredibly grateful for if anyone from the Alaska is on the call. So again, we are planning to provide more templates and resources to make it easier for you all to be as active as possible, not just on LinkedIn, but also maybe with newsletters, etc., flyers for your events, things like that. Because that can be hard for a small chapter. Finance committee can be really helpful to support the treasurer. If you don't have a finance committee, this can be done by the treasurer, but we found it's really nice to have a second person, not just to help with actual tasks, but also to kind of be an auditor too. I know it can be really stressful to be a treasurer, be in charge of money, especially if the chapter is doing a really good job fundraising. So it's nice to have a second set of eyes on things. They also might help facilitate budget requests to the different other committees ahead of setting up the budget, things like that. And then finally, Scholarship Student Liaison Committee, again, optional. If you don't have the funds to do a scholarship or the capacity to get involved with this is kind of college student specific. If you don't have a student chapter in your state or you don't have a university that it makes sense to partner with, you might not need this, or you might be able to assign smaller tasks to different folks. But if you do have a scholarship program, you'll need a committee to help define the application, to the review process, et cetera. That's a lot of work in the beginning. We set it up for Arizona in 2020. We put a lot of time into it. And there's been a lot of time put into it since then. But once it's in place, you can kind of rinse and repeat, but update from lessons learned, et cetera. So usually a lot of work for this committee to start, and then maintenance after that, and seeking out folks to review the scholarships, and actual review of them can be a lot of work as well as it goes on. Any questions on committees or suggested committees, or anything you see missing here? Any comments, etc.?
For the sake of conversation, I think it's interesting which ones you guys designated as core and nice to have.
I struggled with it, honestly. To me,
Yeah.
the way that I designated core was anything that we can't help with, and anything that the officers are probably too busy to do. And so to me, like, the memberships are like I said, the members are your main stakeholders other than your sponsors. And so I think it's really important that you're meeting their needs. The money is what allows us to operate. And so we considered that core. And then the programming events really serves the members as well. And then as far as bylaws and governance, that a lot of times is handled by the president in the first place anyway with new chapters, but having a committee is really helpful too. And so I struggled with it. I could probably be convinced to place some of these core ones and nice to have, and vice versa, honestly, if you had a strong argument one way or the other. But it can be really hard to staff 8 committees. So
Well, yeah, and that's the other thing is I think for us up here, we have, like you touched on many times, like many of these can be kind of combined
yes.
in a way. Especially, I particularly see a pairing between like the education outreach and the student
Totally.
scholarship one. Like those ones can really be paired. Because I'm now realizing Montana doesn't have an education and outreach initiative. We don't actively do that, but we actively do the student liaison and scholarship. So
That's a great point. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point to be made. And maybe when we actually put it up in the collaboration space, we kind of talked through that. Like, we'll point that out. If you're more engaged with the universities, then maybe that this takes the place of education and outreach and core, and vice versa. And education outreach is a lot of work because and it's not always you're not engaged. It's a lot of during the day work, right? Like going to some sort of job fair on a weekday sort of thing. And so it can be tough to start that and keep it going and healthy. I see a hand up from Melissa. Oh,
So I piggybacking kind of on what you were saying, what you like how some of these are, and I've been with the chapter for a while. As it grows and as things progress, one of the things like I've seen, they have it as partnership and fundraising on this slide, but when Julia was president, I was with her, and we have it as sponsorship and fundraising. And last year, I kind of struggled with sponsorship and fundraising being together because I saw them as a little bit separate. Because when we were doing the fundraising and Emily was kind of working on the big sponsorships with the like the corporations, I felt like it was we needed two separate committees for that because it was so huge. Like we felt like it was engulfing us because it was just enormous. But then when Paloma came over this year, like we were talking about it, she was like, okay, I think what I'm going to do is have our chair handle the fundraising and my co-chair handle the sponsorship so that they don't feel like they're overwhelmed and they're going at this and they're eating, they're swallowing it whole, they did it's a collaboration together, but it works better for them, and it's a little bit different because it is bigger now. But
Yeah, and USA has a partnership committee and a fundraising committee, and so other chapters are welcome to do that. We are trying to provide more support on the partnership or sponsorship front. And so, if you don't have capacity, hopefully that support will help you maintain it. But absolutely, I think for Arizona, there's a lot of partners and sponsors, and so I think it makes a lot of sense to have both those roles. And I think Paloma's solution to divvy up the chair and co-chair responsibilities is a good one. Thank you for that, Melissa. I really appreciate it. Any other questions or comments? All right. Okay, how about a quick 5-minute bio break? Because I could use some more water. So we'll just pause until 10. For me, it's 10:35. For others, obviously different times, and come back and get started again at 10:35. I don't want to make everybody sit for 2 hours without using the bathroom or grabbing something to drink. So 7 minutes or so, and we'll come back and I'll start talking again at 10:35. Thanks, everybody. Be back in a bit.
All right, we are all set.
Thank you. All right. Now, next we're going to talk about governance documents, and Judy's been very involved in this. Mackenzie from Utah Sorensen is our governance committee chair, and we just got Peter Christensen involved. Really excited about that. I didn't see Mackenzie on the call, I don't think, but Judy will correct me if I'm wrong about anything while I speak, because she has not seen these slides yet. Because she's on that committee and she's helped with that and been chair in the past. So governance documents, we're going to talk a bit about bylaws versus policies and procedures, what belongs in what, and how USA can help a bit. So first we'll talk about bylaws. So bylaws define the chapter's governing structure and establish how major organizational decisions are made. They typically include your organizational purpose or objectives. Again, 2 of those 4 WIM USA commitments we ask you to include. You can include all 4 if you'd like, but at least 2. It also will define officer roles and how elections are held. Often there's a quorum of the number of members which members can vote. So it'll define different types of members, student versus regular members. Sometimes there's a senior category. It depends a bit on the chapter. And so it will depend on what your bylaws state, who has the right to vote, and then your bylaws will usually include a quorum. Often they're quite low because if your membership's really large, it can be tough to get enough people voting. So it could be like 20, you need at least 20% of membership, or it could be 50, whatever makes sense for your chapter. It will also define terms and succession planning. So it can require, probably wouldn't require in bylaws that somebody serve 2 years, but that can be suggested. That, typically elected yearly, but, encouraged to run 2. But more details, and we'll talk about this in a second, can go in policies and procedures. And we'll talk also about why in a second. We'll also usually define committee structure. So pretty basic, broad definition of which committees you have. And again, basic and broad of what their goal is. Specific responsibilities, et cetera, are often in policies and procedures. And then governance requirements. So, what do you need for a quorum at your board meetings? How often do you have to hold your board meetings? Stuff like that. As far as best practices, you don't want to be updating them all the time. You want there to be some organizational stability. Review them periodically, maybe max update them every 3 years. Certainly, typically organization changes enough that you might, within 5 years, there'd typically be an update. You don't want to make a bunch of small amendments. Again, you want, and the way to do that is to avoid putting too much detail in them. You want like enough to guide, but not so much that you're kind of constrained by them, especially because we are volunteers and our involvement kind of will grow and shrink over time. So you place more of that operational detail in policies and procedures. I'd suggest keeping kind of a running list of proposed updates and questions. You can maybe just have the document as a Word document that's with comments, we want to update this next time, etc., so that you don't forget those things. But I wouldn't recommend you reach out to WIM USA and ask to review for a single, amendment to a single part. I'd suggest you keep that list. And again, that's more for that organizational continuity. You just don't want to be updating them all the time. And then make sure that when you do update them, you're really looking at it like, is this actually how we're running things? And so when you do an update, you want that to reflect how the organization is actually run. You don't want them to diverge too much. And if they are starting to diverge, don't be afraid to update them. Like if for some reason there's some big change and it hasn't been 3 to 5 years, it's okay. It's just a recommendation to not be doing it all the time. WIM USA reviews new chapter bylaws and amendments, and we are working on some blank templates to make this easier. And so in the past, Judy did a really good job of keeping track of like the most recent bylaws that had been reviewed, and then we'd send those out. We're going to kind of come up with a blank template is the goal, and then have comments in there like you may want to do this or that depending on your chapter sort of thing, to not only make it easy for a new chapter to not have to be like sifting through things specific to Denver or Arizona or whatever version they're using as an example, and then also to make it easier for updates, and you can kind of see the structure that WIM USA recommends and make it your own. And then again, just avoid making them overly restrictive, or it can lead to a lot of updates. Policies and procedures are where the detail goes. So it kind of helps with the day-to-day, as I've got noted here. So examples, this is certainly not an exhaustive list by any means, but this is everything I could think of. What's your expense reimbursement process? Arizona early on, and I'm not sure if this is still in place or not, but there was a lot of small purchases that needed to be made, and we, in our policies and procedures document back in the day, we had a thing where if you were spending less than $250, if you were a committee chair, you didn't need any other approval. If it was more than that, you needed the approval of, I think like an officer or the president or something, but less than 500. And if it was anything, or less than I can't remember, then some higher number, if it was anything more than $500 or $1,000, the board had to vote on it. Just to make it so that if somebody needed to go buy like a poster or something, or materials for a meeting, they weren't having to wait for the entire board to approve. So examples of expense reimbursement and like what expenses can be made without that approval is a great thing to put in that. Event planning workflows, how you track sponsors, social media guidance, your meetings formats and cadence. So how often you suggest committees meet, whether or not they meet, etc. Scholarship review process, volunteer onboarding is a big one. What do you do when a new volunteer gets involved? We used to have at Arizona a welcome to WIM presentation that was just kind of a component of our policies and procedures, that every time we'd get a new person involved, it would get updated a little bit because little things may have changed, and we'd walk them through that presentation. So here's how we do things. Here's what the different roles are. Here's how you can get involved. And then also file storage and transition. So who's in charge of the file storage? What is it? Are you using the Google Drive? What makes the most sense? And then how do you transition that information between roles? This can be updated as often as you want. There doesn't need to be a vote. WIM USA doesn't need to review. And so it should kind of be like a living document, although it's good to put, if you have a bylaws and governance committee, to make them kind of the owner of it. So maybe there's suggested changes by others and they get to approve it. If you don't, maybe it's the president, or that would be a great role for the vice president if you don't have a committee. Make sure that they're easily accessible. These and the bylaws ideally are easily accessible. When you bring someone on, especially before they even get elected or appointed as an officer or a committee chair, really strongly encourage they read the bylaws. They're dry documents, but if you read it once, It can just serve as a reference in the future. And same with this, keep a running list of improvements or updates if you're not actively updating it as you go. So again, this one can be updated a lot more often. And we recommend that you do really make sure you can make it as detailed or otherwise as possible. It might not be like a single Word document. It might be a folder where you've got a bunch of different presentations. It might be like the WIM collaboration space site. It can really be whatever makes the most sense for your chapter. WIM USA is working on updating our policies and procedures this year. Mackenzie's goal is to have it done by the end of our fiscal year. It's a big effort because ours has not been updated in a really long time and a lot has changed recently. And so that's why I say it's ideally you're keeping it up to date, and US do what we say, not what we do, I guess. In this particular instance, WIM USA has not been updating it regularly. We're going to start because it can be a big undertaking if you're not doing so. And again, like a presentation like this can be a policies and procedures presentation or part of policies and procedures as well. Judy's mentioning that there's a Google Drive. Yeah, it's really great to have, just a shared file space is really important. We can probably help you with that if you don't already have one. That's accessible by everybody. We've had to change a couple different times because certain companies don't allow access to certain sites. And ideally, you have a space where it's really easy. Arizona used to use Slack, and so there was links to that in the Slack everywhere. But encourage your committee to bookmark those pages so they have easy access to it if you don't have another place to store it. Any questions about bylaws versus policies and procedures before I move on to suggested other governance documents? Other suggestions, and again, this can all be part of policies and procedures, or it might be something different. Officer transition documents. So, you can include in this, attend the WIM USA Governance session. That will now be an annual thing as kind of part of your onboarding. An annual planning calendar. So that could be a live Google calendar or whatever you use, or a spreadsheet. I think, some sort of calendar, budget tracker, sponsorship tracker. Again, depending on your committee structure, you can put these in the hands of your different committees, or it might be the officers. Event planning templates, meeting agenda templates are really nice. I'm a stickler. I do not like to go over on meeting times. When I do, I feel really guilty because people are really busy, especially because we're a volunteer organization, and having like a set agenda that you go through every time with room for flexibility is a really great way to make sure that you're not taking up too much of your volunteers' time. Having a parking lot involved in that for things that can kind of lead you astray to come back to later is also a good practice. Shared contact lists so that everybody knows how to get a hold of each other, committee charters and responsibilities. Again, that can be part of policies and procedures, however, you want to do it, but also really good to store it. That was often in Power or some sort of Google slide or PowerPoint presentation for Arizona in the past. And then committees were responsible for updating it. Password and account management documentation, shared file storage structure again, and then volunteer onboarding materials. And then I cannot emphasize enough. It's so easy to use your own account to store things, but I can't tell you how often it's gotten in the way of stuff at both the USA and chapter level that somebody's just been working out of their own OneDrive or whatever, and then they are on vacation or they get sick or something, and people can't get to all the hard work they did on whatever documents they need to keep the chapter moving. So you don't want just one person to have access to anything. You want everybody, there to be backups there in an organization, in a volunteer organization like this, because people fall off for all kinds of reasons. I used to say they could get hit by the beer truck. Skyly told me that was too morbid, so she said say they can win the lottery, and now I always accidentally say get hit by the lottery truck. So, but that's the example, right? If somebody were to fall off the face of the earth, you want to have backups. And then be documenting everything before leadership transitions occur, so as much as possible. Any questions on that? I think that's the last governance document slide. Or wait, no. Did I skip one? I think I skipped one. I did. Oh, there you go. I skipped this slide. Again, it's just kind of re-summarizing everything. Again, I'm not going to read everything on every slide necessarily, because this part of it is just to make sure we've got this ready to go into the collaboration space. But this kind of helps lay out the difference of the bylaws, which define governance and how it's run and the policies and procedures, which is how it operates and how it how the day-to-day things happen. And again, be careful about putting operational details in the bylaws, largely just because, like, sure, it seems great to require that your chair have 2 years of involvement with the chapter today, but what if you get a bunch of volunteer fall off? And then it's in your bylaws that in order to have a committee chair fill a role, they have to have been involved for 2 years. Like, how do you fill that committee then? And so that can be a recommendation that ends up in the policies and procedures, but you just don't want to hem yourself in a bunch of different ways and prevent yourself from being able to staff your committee or, do things a little differently without a huge bylaw review that requires WIM USA review, et cetera. So you want to leave room for adaptation, growth, and just like bringing new people in, and making sure that you can adjust for different schedules as well. Judy, did I mess anything up? State anything crazy? Okay, good. I see 2 thumbs up. All right, if there's no questions on that stuff, we'll move on to leadership culture. And I believe this is the last section, but there's a few slides in it. So, and then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about next meeting. And there should be some time for any general questions or discussion, if helpful. Oops. All right, leadership culture and volunteer management. I can't say enough. Delegate, delegate, delegate. Again, I mentioned how to get people involved. Giving them a job is honestly, getting them involved is one thing. Keeping them involved is another. Giving them a job, giving them ownership over something is huge. And so that, to me, I can't stress enough, not only because you want to get them committed, but also because I've seen, myself included, take on, as a chapter president, way too much in the beginning and get totally burnt out, and then, need to bring a bunch of people in and get them onboarded really fast. And so from the very beginning, trust your committee chairs and volunteers. We're not doing brain surgery. We're a volunteer organization. We want to be as professional as possible, but at the same time, nothing's ever going to be perfect. And that's okay. So set as clear of expectations and accountability as possible. I did mention, I do think putting some sort of volunteer involvement length before you're considered for elected positions is completely belongs in bylaws. If that's something that you think you can manage, saying we want you to have been involved in the organization for a year before you can be elected to a position, that I think does belong in bylaws, because usually if you're going to go through the process of an election, you want to know that that person's committed and what they're capable of and everything. And so I'm mentioning that now because clear expectations and accountability, especially for officer positions, or committee positions, are relatively easy to swap out if you need to. They're appointed. Those elected ones, make sure they know what the expectations and that they need to be accountable. And the best way to kind of do that is not just communicate it, but if they've been involved for a year and kind of see what the role consists of. And so I just want to mention that caveat from before, that setting the how long you should have been involved to be an officer makes a lot of sense to me. You don't have to put it in bylaws, but having that kind of in policies and procedures certainly does make some sense. Sorry, back to this. Communicating regularly and proactively. And I have this kind of highlighted over here on the right too. You might feel like you're repeating yourself, but not everybody can make every meeting. We've got folks involved. If you have a meeting every Friday or something like that, you want people on site to be involved. A lot of times they get every other Friday off, so they might not be able to come to every meeting. It might be repetitive for some people, but it's the best way to keep people informed and involved. If you're planning a big event or initiative or something, you may be repeating yourself a lot at the beginning of meetings. Do it quickly and make sure you point towards areas where they can get more information, so you're not spending too much time repeating yourself. But communicating early, often, and repeatedly, I would highly recommend. Recognizing and appreciating contributions. Again, we're all doing this in our free time. People have families, they have jobs that actually pay their bills. Making sure that you're recognizing when somebody's going above and beyond is a great way to keep them involved as well. And I see WIM as like the best leadership crash course you could ever get. Like, managing volunteers is tough. And so whether you're running a committee or a whole chapter, you learn a lot. And so think of it as you're developing future leaders for the chapter, for the industry overall. You don't just have a bunch of volunteers that are going to be tangentially involved. Always be keeping an eye out for who might want to fill a leadership position. Because it's for me, I learned so much. I was already managing people in a leadership position in my company when I got involved in WIM, but I like accelerated my growth incredibly, getting involved in women in mining in 2019, I think is when I first got involved. And it's impacted the way that I lead my like the team that I get paid to manage today in a positive way. Um, and then again, we're just all volunteers balancing lots of different things. And it's really about enabling others and not doing everything yourself. Even if you, and that this is just management in general. Many of you know this already. Of course, you can do things faster in the moment, but if you're teaching others how to do it, it'll take up your plate in the future. Oh, I skipped 2 slides again. And so just another note on managing volunteers, it's very different in my experience from managing people that rely on you for a paycheck. Make sure you're matching responsibilities to interests and availability. This can be tough. Not everybody's interested in bylaws and governance. I honestly find that stuff very interesting. And I know Mackenzie does too, and Judy, but not everybody feels that way. So sometimes you have to do some like really targeted reach outs, identify people you think might be good at it. Because most people are going to come in and say, I'm really passionate about education and outreach, or I'm really passionate about event planning or this or that, not necessarily the stuff that is can be considered a bit more boring. Documentation again is super important because you're a volunteer too, so you might not have time to meet with them all the time. But if you can point them towards a document or a presentation, or have that handy, it'll speed up onboarding meetings. Following up regularly, again, Slack worked really well for WIM Arizona at the time when the chapter was first getting started. It was an easy way to not clutter inboxes and be able to just ping someone and say, hey, how's this going? Or throughout the day, ask questions both ways. Engagement levels are going to vary over time. People are going to be super involved for a couple months and then need to commit to their work for a couple months. I used to travel to Africa for like 4 to 6 weeks at a time, and I was fortunate to have a vice president. Well, I guess I was president mostly during COVID, so I only did that once maybe while I was president. But I was fortunate to have a backup when I was traveling a bunch and not always able to be there. And so be aware that you're just going to have to be flexible with some of that. And then this one's pretty important. People need encouragement before taking on larger roles. When Anita suggested I run for president of Arizona, I was like, me? What? No. Like that's ridiculous. And then of course I ended up doing it and I loved it and I'm so grateful and I'm here today. And so a lot of people we have a lot of, we've diversified age-wise a lot, but we have a lot of younger folks that get involved. They see WIM as more approachable than some other organizations. And so maybe don't put them in a hugely important officer role right away, but make them feel like they can do it. And I think you'd be surprised sometimes at what you find that if even if they don't have leadership experience, that they can gain a lot by running a committee. And if you've got people there to support them, you'll end up with a long-term volunteer there. But not every volunteer is going to become a future leader. You don't necessarily have to invest a whole bunch of time in everybody. Some people are just going to show up and help out where they can, when they can, and that's totally okay. Any comments or questions on this? All right. And then building continuity and sustainability. I think this is well, not quite the last slide, but almost. Again, I just am stressing documentation over and over and maintaining organized records and shared files. Creating opportunities for future leaders, making sure that you're thinking about your succession planning. Like the minute I was president of WIM USA, I was starting to think, well, who should come after me? And obviously it's not totally up to me, but at the same time, I can start preparing people and suggesting people start thinking about it. And then in the long run, the nominating committee will make that decision along with the board. But if I'm not thinking about it in year one, then we might not have. You sometimes then rush to fill a position, and that's not always the best result. Although sometimes it can work out really well. Yeah, get people involved before vacancies occur. So if somebody's interested in getting more involved and you already have a chair of a committee, put them on the committee and get them involved. And so when that chair is ready to move on, you've got somebody backed up. Again, giving committee chairs meaningful ownership. If they don't do it perfectly or they drop the ball from now to now, every now and then, it's okay. Don't be afraid to let them fail. That's really tough for me, and it was especially tough for me in WIM because I wanted the organization to be successful in every way, but you just can't, as a volunteer, micromanage people. It's impossible. And And then also sorry, we already kind of talked about planning for leadership transitions. Some questions to ask listed here. I think it's also really important to note that once we take on the ownership of these committees, it can be really hard to let go of it. And once you've identified the next leader, the next president, the next committee chair, or whatever, give them the freedom to make the role their own and to build on that foundation that you and your team created for them. It can be tough to not be like, wait, no, that's not how you do it. And in some cases, you may need to step in, but for the most part, there's a lot of ways to run a chapter. And if you've got a new leader in place that wants to do something differently from you, to me, that means that they're committed and invested and they have ownership. And that's a good sign. I literally stopped attending Arizona meetings for a bit because it was so hard for people to not look to me for stuff. And I wanted that new president to have, to feel like, she was the leader and for them to see her that way. And so I would come to one in every 3 or something to make sure that she had that respect and leadership, and they weren't always looking to me, and that worked out really well. And I think it can be really, really hard to let go, but you gotta. And again, even if a chapter president fails, we will help pick it back up. I think it's unlikely if they've gotten that far, but um, uh, step back as much as you can without abandoning them, because that's not good either. Be there for them when they need you, I think, is the main thing, but not necessarily let them kind of make it their own and do their thing, and try not to exert your influence too much once it's time for you to move on. I know that chapters have struggled with this. I've personally struggled with this in both directions. Well, yeah, in both directions, I guess, a little bit. Usually intentions are really positive, but getting too involved in a new leader's, way of things can inhibit them more than help them in the long run in some cases. So don't be afraid to let go of it. And then this is just kind of an overarching note. Delegation and empowering others is like incredibly important. You heard that over the last few slides. Not all volunteers will be able to commit they're all the time, but that's okay. And just to reiterate, things do not have to be perfect. That is tough for me as a perfectionist, but we're all doing our best, and any progress is good progress, especially in a volunteer organization. If you try to make your chapter perfect or your role perfect, you're probably going to burn out, and we don't want to lose you. So reach out for help when it's needed. And sometimes 80% is better than 100%. If it takes 15 times as long to get to 100, don't be afraid to let things move forward without, that perfect touch on it. Any questions on that stuff before we talk about the next meeting and open it up for any kind of general questions or suggestions for the next meeting? Thanks, Kimberly. All right, I will so next meeting, this list might be a little outdated because we did a little bit of reorganization, but let's look at the first slide really quick that talked about what was going to be talked about here, because that's probably a little better. Oh, that's not it. This is it. All right, we'll talk a bit about, again, elections and succession planning, kind of meeting cadence, chapter operations, volunteer and committee engagement. So we talked a lot about that today, but just how to keep them involved in some of the stuff we touched on but didn't have slides on. Financial and legal considerations. This will also include insurance. WIM USA recently in the last couple of years got board insurance, and some considerations for if your chapter wants to consider doing the same, and cost and how you might do that. Fundraising and sponsorship. So that'll be a lot around how you can work with WIM USA, how you can work on your own, make it your own, whatever makes sense for your chapter. And then just going over some of the templates, tools, and resources we already have, and then asking for your suggestions on what else would be helpful to add to that. This is my slightly unhinged thank you slide. Sometimes I love to use WIM to exercise. Oh, sorry, at the end there. The final slide, Emily, I forgot I was looking on my screen and not everybody else's. I love to use WIM to exercise my creativity and slide creation because I can't do it in my day job. But any questions overall or suggestions, anything you didn't see on the list that you want covered, ideas, complaints? The others popping back in. Good. I'm so glad it's been helpful for folks. Thank you, Laura. Again, this recording will be posted to the collaboration space. The slides will be posted to the collaboration space. Once we wrap up the second meeting on June 12th, we will put some of this content directly in some of the tabs on the collaboration space. And we plan to do this every year. And so you can work it into your chapters onboarding with new officers, new committee chairs, etc. If you think we should be covering something different or we're spending too much time on one thing or another, let us know. We're here as a service to you all, so we want to make it as valuable as possible to you. So please don't hesitate to make suggestions. Thank you so much for being here, investing over an hour and a half on a Friday to your chapter and to WIM. Can't appreciate it more than you know. I hope everybody has a great weekend. Yes, I will share a link to the collaboration space.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was awesome.
Thank you all for being here.
Nice work, Julia.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks for everybody's help in putting all the various components together.
Thanks, Julia. It was phenomenal.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'm gonna sign off and get back to my other job, but great to see some folks. Great to see you, Melissa. It's been a while.
Bye, Judy.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.